Chapter 2. The Village That Wouldn't Die. Stone's boots found the Undercroft's floor like a verdict. The stair behind them exhaled cold, and the chapel above felt suddenly very far away. An innocent lie built of timber and hymns. Down here the stone had teeth. The walls were old, older than the town, older than the Republic's tidy maps. Mortar seams ran like veins. In places, the rock bulged as if something had pressed from the inside, and then thought better of showing itself. Water dripped somewhere deeper, patient as a clock. Mara held them in the mouth of the corridor and watched the air. The wax in her ears turned the world into a thick, distant thing. Noisy only in the bones. Sound came through as blunt pressure. Enough to keep you alive. Not enough to let the blight slip a word into the soft place behind your eyes. Kellen signaled right, branching corridor, and then swept his hand low, palm down. Slow. No hurry. No chase. Rook crouched, knife angled down, eyes on the seams in the stone, like he expected them to blink. His scar pulled at his lip, trying to become a joke, failing. Stone stood half a step ahead, shield harness ready, shoulders wide enough to be a door in a narrow hall. Halden stayed close to Mara's left, satchel hugged to her ribs. Her gaze flicked to every dark corner, not as fear, but as triage. Iriel moved behind them like a shadow, with the scholar's hands, charcoal and chalk ready. Hood up, ears plugged beneath cloth. Z brought up the rear, beside Mara, not guarding so much as anchoring the room. Her stillness making the Undercroft feel more aware of itself. Ebris descended last, between Holden and Stone, palms raised as if the stone might accuse him. Wax and cloth packed in his ears, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow. He clutched his slate so hard, his knuckles went white. Mara tapped his wrist once. Stay close. Ebris nodded too fast. Ahead, the right-hand corridor narrowed, and then opened into a squat chamber. The lantern's glow crawled across the floor and caught on something that made Mara stop without meaning to. A ring, not drawn, not carved, grown. It lay half-sunken into the stone like a bruise that had decided to become architecture. Dark veining arranged in a near-perfect circle, threads branching outward in spokes. The pattern wasn't decorative. It was functional. Everything about it suggested intention. Iriel's breath hitched behind Wax. She knelt at the threshold, held her charcoal over the ring without touching it, eyes narrowing. War geometry, she mouthed, then shook her head and corrected herself with a sharp gesture. Not a ward. A diagram. Kellen's hand lifted in a caution sign. He pointed to the spokes. Tracking, measuring. Rook leaned in just enough to see without being seen. That's new, he muttered, voice muffled and useless to anyone but his own chest. Z's gaze fixed on the circle as if recognizing a language she wished she didn't know. It remembers, she said softly. Mara didn't like the way the word landed. A circle that remembered meant someone had built it to hold more than shape. It meant the blight wasn't only spreading, it was recording. Do we go around? Halden asked, voice barely a vibration through wax. Mara looked at Iriel. Iriel's fingers moved, two small signs, precise and grim. If we cross it, it will know we crossed. If we avoid it, it will know we avoided. That was the Blight's favorite kind of trap. A question where every answer gave it something. Mara signaled, "Don't step into the ring." Stone shifted his weight and moved around the chamber's edge, careful not to scrape stone. The others followed, hugging the wall like soldiers skirting a mine. Z stepped last, her boots soundless, her presence making the lantern flame tighten as if it wanted to recoil. As they passed, the ring did nothing dramatic. No flare, no scream in the weave. Just a faint tightening in Mara's skin, like the sense you got when someone watched you from behind a curtain and smiled. They moved deeper. The corridor beyond bent, and the stone changed. It became smoother, as if it had been polished by years of contact. Not boots, not hands, something else. Something that slid rather than stepped. Then the lantern light caught on more of the veining. Hairline cracks filled with dark filament, the way roots filled soil. But this wasn't root. This was writing. A script laid into the bones of the town. Ibris stopped so hard, Halden nearly collided with him. He lifted his slate, hands shaking, and scratched furiously. Not here before. It grows fast. Mara felt the old anger return, slow and hot. 5 days? 14 hours? And already the Blight had learned stone. Kellen signaled ahead, left branch now, and then pointed down. A slope, a deeper drop. The air smelled sweeter there, faintly, like fruit left too long in a cellar. Under that sweetness was iron and damp and something else, something that belonged in a living body, not in rock. Halden's eyes narrowed. She mouthed one word, almost instinctive. Fever. They descended. The undercroft opened into a wider space, an old cistern chamber perhaps, or the bones of something built before Larchgate had a name. Pillars held the ceiling in thick, squat columns. The floor glistened with shallow water that reflected the lantern's glow in broken pieces. In those reflections, Mara saw movement and refused to look at it twice. Not because she was afraid of shadows, because the Blight liked reflections. It liked the mind's habit of filling gaps. Eyes on substance, Mara mouthed, not on mirrors. The Rook lifted his knife and held the flat toward the lantern to kill the glare. Stone stepped forward, testing each patch of water with the toe of his boot. Kellen moved along the edge, scanning pillar bases, corners, cracks. Iriel knelt and pressed 2 fingers to the stone, eyes closed. For a heartbeat, Mara thought she saw the air around Iriel's hand shiver, like heat haze, like pain. Then Iriel's eyes snapped open, and she signed quickly. The weave is tugged here, like a net pulled tight. Something is attached. Z's voice came calm, and it made Mara's stomach tighten. Above, Z said, and below. Mara glanced up at the ceiling, stone, wet, intact. Z's gaze didn't follow hers. Z wasn't looking with eyes. It threads both ways, Z said. It is not hiding, it is building. Ebris made a muffled sound, a small panicked exhale through wax, and pointed toward a far wall, where the water pooled darkest. His slate followed, scratched with frantic urgency. There. Mara signaled Stone and Rook. Stone advanced, shield harness shifting. Rook flanked him, knife ready. The dark pool wasn't deep, just shadowed. But the wall behind it was wrong. Stone fused with something fibrous, like bark grown into masonry. The veining thickened there, climbing in branching lines. And embedded in the stone, half swallowed, were objects. Not bones, not skulls, tools, a saw, a hammer, a small iron bell with its clapper missing, a child's spoon. All of it sunk into the wall as if the Blight had pressed the town's life into the stone to see what it tasted like. Halden's face tightened. "It's cataloging," she mouthed. Kellen pointed to the bell, then tapped his temple. Sound. It took the part that makes it. Mara felt cold creep up her spine. A bell without a clapper was not just ruined, it was disarmed. The Blight didn't want accidental noise. It wanted controlled noise, curated, chosen. It wanted to decide what got heard. Iriel's fingers moved. Trap. Z's head angled. "It wants you to touch," she said. "Touch is a question. Touch is permission." Rook's knife hand tightened. "Then we don't give it permission." Mara was about to signal withdrawal when Ebris suddenly lurched forward. 2 steps, fast, desperate, as if something had yanked him by the heart. Halden grabbed his coat and hauled him back, hard. Stone caught his shoulder before he fell. Ebris's eyes were huge. He clawed at his own chest as if he couldn't breathe. His slate slipped and clattered, muffled but sharp enough through water to make Mara's body react. The lantern flame flickered, not from wind, from attention. Mara's skin tightened again, that sensation of being watched from very close. Z spoke, still calm, and it chilled Mara more than panic would have. "It liked that," Z said. "It noticed the mistake." Mara signaled hard. "Back, now." They moved away from the wall, keeping their spacing. Iriel drew a quick chalk mark on the pillar, an anchor, a warning. Kellen swept behind them, played out now, eyes scanning for movement that didn't make footsteps. Ebris shook violently, tears tracking down his cheeks without sound. He clawed his slate and scratched 3 words so hard the stone squealed. "They are here." Mara held him by the shoulder, met his eyes, and made him look at her. Forced focus. "Where?" Ebris pointed upward, then toward the chapel direction, then toward the town itself. Above. Everywhere. Halden's breathing went shallow. "We need to get him out," she mouthed. Stone nodded once. Rook's gaze stayed hard. "This place is a throat," he muttered, "and we just coughed in it." Mara's mind ran like a field report. They had confirmation of Blight infrastructure, evidence of learning behavior, time distortion, hooks tied to sound, and a living witness who looked like he had survived by amputating his own senses. They'd come for assessment. They'd found a system. Now the system had found them. Mara signaled, "Up, same way, fast." They moved. The climb back through the corridor felt steeper than it had on the way down, as if the stone itself wanted to keep them. The lantern's light jittered on the veined walls. The ring chamber waited for them again, silent and patient. As Stone stepped past it, Mara felt something in the air tighten, like a muscle flexing beneath skin. The ring was learning their gait. Iriel stopped long enough to drag a chalk line across one of the spokes. An intentional scratch, a lie inserted into the pattern, a sabotage kiss. Then they were back at the stair, up into the chapel. The air above was warmer, and it should have felt like relief. It didn't. Because the chapel was no longer empty. Someone sat in the front pew. A woman, middle-aged, hair tied back, shawl around her shoulders. She faced the altar as if waiting for service. Her hands rested neatly in her lap. Her posture was too still, too composed for panic, too calm for a village that had gone silent 5 days. Holden froze. Stone's hand tightened on the strap of his shield harness. Rook's knife came up. Mara's pulse hammered. Her wax-muted hearing made the room thick, unreal. She watched the woman's shoulders. No tremor, no breath shift, no fidget. A second figure stood near the side aisle, an old man with a fisher's coat, head tilted, eyes fixed on them with mild curiosity. Then a third, near the back, half hidden behind a pillar. A boy, maybe 10, holding a wooden toy. They hadn't heard them enter. They hadn't heard them exist. Kellen slid sideways, scanning windows, doors, exits. Too many angles. Mara raised her fist. Halt! And the team locked. The woman in the pew turned her head slowly. Her smile came like a lantern being lit. Not warm, not human. Her lips parted, and Mara saw something pale glistening along her gums, filament like wet thread. She spoke. Mara didn't hear the words through wax, but she saw the shape of them. And she knew, with the cold certainty of field instinct, that the Blight had learned how to put language in a mouth. The boy lifted his toy, as if offering it. The old man's eyes widened with delighted recognition, like they were seeing heroes for the first time, like they had been waiting. Ebris made a strangled sound in his throat, more animal than man, and clawed at Mara's sleeve, frantic. His slate flashed up, the message gouged so hard it looked like it might bleed. They don't die. They stay. They learn you. The woman's smile widened, too wide for her face. And in the wax-muted hush of the chapel, the villagers began to rise, slowly, carefully, like puppets remembering the strings. Not attacking. Not yet. Just standing, just watching, just practicing what a town looked like when it decided to move again. Mara did not move. Not because fear nailed her to the floor. Fear was a tool, not a master. But because the first thing the Blight stole from a soldier was urgency. It taught you to react. It taught you to answer. It taught you to be dragged by the nose into whatever shape it wanted. The villagers rose slowly, like a congregation waiting for a cue. No charge, no scream, no flurry of knives and teeth. Just bodies, remembering the idea of standing. The woman in the pew, kept smiling. Her eyes were too wet, too bright, as if the lids didn't know how to blink anymore. Filament gleamed at her gums when she breathed. It was not blood. It was not spit. It looked like something that belonged in a spider's den. The old man by the aisle shifted his weight, and then stopped again, as if he'd remembered his role in a play. The boy's toy, painted soldier, wooden sword, hung in his small hand like an offering. Mara's gaze swept them, cataloguing with the cold discipline Director Dane preferred to call prudence. No obvious weapons, no overt aggression, perfect spacing, all eyes on them. It wasn't a mob, it was a net. Rook's knife had risen without his permission. The blade trembled just slightly, not from fear, from anger. His scar pulled tight, trying to become a snarl. Stone's stance widened into breech posture. He became the doorway. Every line of him said, "I will hold." Halden's hand hovered over her satchel like she could bandage a phenomenon. Her eyes kept flicking to the villagers' throats, checking for breath, checking for pulse by sight alone, looking for the human truth under the Blight's mask. Iriel's charcoal was already in her fingers. She wasn't drawing a ward this time. She was drawing a map of exits in her mind. Kellen had shifted to the left side aisle, body angled like a drawn bow. His amber gold eyes did not blink. He watched hands. He watched the toy. He watched the soft spaces where something could hide. Z stood behind Mara, stillness absolute. The air around her had tightened, charged, controlled, restrained by doctrine and by Mara's will. Ebris shook so hard his teeth likely clicked behind wax. He clawed at Mara's sleeve again, frantic, his slate lifted like a shield. "Don't speak, don't answer. They want your words." Mara kept her eyes on the smiling woman. She signaled with 2 fingers, small and precise. No names, no voices. Then she signaled Kellen. "Count." Kellen's gaze slid past the pews, past the columns, to the door. 3 became 6. 6 became 10. Shadows behind pillars. A figure in the choir loft. A girl in a patched dress near the side entrance. Hands folded like prayer. They had not heard them come in. The Blight wasn't bringing people in. It was revealing them, like a curtain being lifted. Halden's breath came shallow behind wax and cloth. She mouthed a question. "Alive?" Mara didn't have an answer. That was the worst kind of horror. Uncertainty wearing a familiar face. The smiling woman stood, slowly, carefully, like she was learning how joints worked again. She stepped into the aisle. Her mouth moved. Mara couldn't hear the words, but she saw the shape, the careful pursing of lips, the gentle widening of vowels, the practice of human sound. The woman's eyes stayed on Mara, unblinking, and her expression held something that might have been gratitude or hunger. Behind her, the old man lifted his hands to his chest and tapped twice, an echo of the oath-bearer gesture for oath. Mara's blood went cold. It wasn't just learning language. It was learning them. Rook's knife twitched. Mara snapped her fingers once, silent command, and Rook froze. He hated that he froze. That was visible in the tension of his forearm, the anger that wanted to spill. Mara's mind ran through doctrine. Infected civilians avoid contact. If they engage, disengage. If they block egress, breach. Do not allow quarantine failure. The Republic wrote those lines in clean ink on white pages. No one wrote what it felt like to aim a blade at a child holding a toy. The boy took a step forward. He held the wooden soldier up, arms extended like a gift for visiting heroes. His smile looked almost normal until you saw his teeth. Too white, too clean, too even. As if the mouth had been redesigned by someone who only knew teeth from a diagram. A thin filament glistened at the corner of his lips. Halden flinched. Tiny, involuntary, then steadied. Her eyes shone with something like grief. Stone shifted half a step between Halden and the boy without being told. Mara felt the impulse, strong animal to speak, to say stop, to say stay back, to say we're here to help. Words were bridges. The Blight loved bridges. Mara lifted her hand, palm down, and signaled, back, out, now. Stone moved first, slow and deliberate, backing toward the chapel door while keeping his bulk between the team and the villagers. Rook mirrored him, knife held low, refusing to give the Blight the satisfaction of seeing his fear in a raised blade. Kellen drifted backward, eyes still counting, mapping. Iriel slid a small ward stone from her pouch and dropped it at the edge of the aisle. No flourish, just a seed of geometry, meant to delay. Halden gripped Ibris's elbow and guided him, gentle but firm. Ibris resisted for half a heartbeat, not because he wanted to stay, but because the villagers' faces held him like a spell. Then he stumbled backward, eyes fixed on the smiling woman as if she were a memory that had turned traitor. Z backed with Mara, unhurried, controlled. The villagers advanced at the same pace, not chasing, matching. Like dancers, keeping a pattern. Mara reached the threshold. The fog outside had thickened. The daylight beyond the door looked pale and wrong, like a painting that had forgotten the color blue. She stepped out. Stone stepped out. Rook stepped out. Halden pulled Ibris out. Iriel out. Kellen out. Z out. The villagers stopped at the chapel doorway, as if an invisible line held them. They did not cross. They stood in the shade of the threshold, smiling and watching, their bodies perfectly still, except for the tiny synchronized tilt of heads. Curiosity made mechanical. Mara's eyes narrowed. A boundary, not theirs. The Blight's. It had set a rule. The chapel is the stage. And it had waited there, ready to see what heroes did when confronted with the unkillable familiar. Why don't they come out? Rook's voice was a muffled vibration through wax, more growl than question. Z answered quietly, because it doesn't need to. Mara's pulse hammered. She studied the street, the market square beyond. The town still looked paused. Stalls empty, doors shut, no smoke, no animals. But now she knew the stillness wasn't absence. It was restraint, a held breath. Halden tugged Mara's sleeve, eyes urgent and pointed. Across the street, a window shutter moved. Just a fraction, not opening, peeking. Then it stopped again, and another shutter shifted down the lane. Then another. A ripple of tiny movements, synchronized, like eyelids adjusting. Mara's skin tightened. The whole town was waking up, not in chaos, in coordination. Kellen signaled quickly, perimeter compromised, then pointed to the gate. They had to leave while leaving was still an option. Mara signaled, to the palisade. Fast, quiet. They moved along the main lane. The market square watched them with too much empty space. The child's toy from earlier still lay by the barrel, painted face smiling. As they passed, the toy rolled, just an inch, without wind. Rook swore under his breath, and Mara saw his jaw clench hard enough to crack a tooth. At the gate, Stone paused, listening with his body. The air beyond the palisade felt less tense, not safe, just less trapped. Mara nodded once. Go. Stone and Rook lifted the bar, and the gate swung open without a squeal. Outside, the fog seemed to hesitate, as if it didn't want to let them go. Then, from deeper in the town, through wax, through dampener, through stone, Mara felt a vibration. Not a word. Not a scream. A chorus trying to become one. The villagers in the chapel doorway lifted their hands together. They did not wave. They did not beckon. They performed a gesture, slow, deliberate, practiced. A fist to the chest. An oath. Halden stumbled, catching herself. Her eyes widened with horror, so sharp it looked like pain. They saw us do that, she mouthed. They remembered, Z said. Mara dragged her gaze away and pushed the team through the gate. They moved up the slope toward the tree line, keeping formation, refusing to run. Running would make noise. Noise would make panic. Panic would make mistakes. Behind them, Larchgate remained intact and quiet and wrong. And yet, as they climbed, Mara could feel it like pressure at the back of her skull. The town was not dead. It was waiting. They reached the rise where they'd first looked down at the valley. From there, the palisade looked ordinary again. A simple ring of wood and fog. Mara's hands shook once, small, controlled, then steadied. She looked at Ebris, who could barely stand, eyes wide and wet. He lifted his slate and scratched the final line with trembling desperation. It doesn't kill fast. It keeps you. It practices being you. Mara stared down at the silent town and understood the scale of what they'd found. If the Blight could hold people, keep them functional, quiet, obedient, then it didn't need to overrun the Republic with fire. It could walk into the West, wearing familiar faces. It could take a city without ever breaking a wall. Mara turned to her team and signaled the next truth. Clear, ruthless. Break contact. Now. And as the seventh oath slipped back into the tree line, Larchgate stayed still beneath its fog lid. a village that refused to die, because the thing inside it had found a better use for the living. They did not run. Running made noise, and noise made stories. Stories the Blight could swallow whole and wear like a coat. Mara kept them moving fast in the only way the hero program taught you to move when you wanted to stay alive. Efficient, disciplined, silent. Trees swallowed them. Pines, black and close, needles drinking fog. Their eyes fell away behind them until Larchgate vanished from view, hidden again beneath its lid of mist, and waiting. Mara didn't let herself believe that meant distance. The Blight wasn't a wolf you outran. It was a mold you carried on your boot. Kellen moved point, slipping between trunks, like a thought no one could pin down. Rook stayed close to Stone's left shoulder, blade low. Halden kept Ebris moving, one hand under his elbow, like she was guiding a drunk out of a tavern, except Ebris's terror was sober and unshakable. Iriel left small chalk marks on bark and stone, quiet breadcrumbs that were less navigation and more denial, a way of telling the weave, we were here, and we are leaving. Z stayed with Mara, a presence that made the forest feel as if it were trying not to stare. After a quarter mile, Mara signaled a halt. They froze in the trees. Fog sifted between branches in thin ribbons. Somewhere, water moved, too smooth to be trusted. Mara pointed to ears, wax and cloth still in place, then to eyes. Watch. She lifted a fist and held it tight. Wait. Nothing happened. And that was how the Blight hunted. By letting you supply your own dread, by letting your mind gnaw on silence until you invented teeth. Then behind them, something shifted. Not a footstep, not a crack of branch, a change in pressure, like the air itself had leaned a fraction toward the trail they'd taken. Z's head angled. It's tasting our wake, she said quietly. Mara's fingers tightened into the anchor sign. Palm toward Z, command held. Hold. Z obeyed without comment. The air around her stayed charged, but contained. Mara felt the weight of doctrine settle over them like armor. Z was last resort. Z was history. Z was what you used only when you were prepared to live with the scar. Kellen ghosted back to Mara's side and signed quickly. Behind. Not one. Many. Mara's blood cooled. Many could mean anything in a forest. Rook's scar pulled. His knife lifted a hair. Villagers, he mouthed, disgusted, rage and dread sharing the same jaw. Halden shook her head sharply. No, no, no. Like refusing the word could keep it from being true. Iriel's fingers danced. Listen with eyes. They watched. And finally, through the fog between trunks, they saw movement. A figure stepped into view, 20 yards back on the trail. A man in a timber coat, hands empty, head tilted. Curious, he stood in the open without urgency, without need. Then another figure emerged to his left, then another to his right. They did not fan out like hunters. They formed a line, like a choir. They were too far for Mara to see faces clearly, but she could see posture. Upright, calm, patient. The way the chapel congregation had risen. The same cadence of movement. The villagers hadn't chased them. They'd followed, like a demonstration. Like a lesson. Ebris made a small sound in his throat and nearly crumpled. Halden caught him, held him against her like a shield, her eyes bright with fury she didn't have words for. The line of villagers stopped. They did not advance further into the trees. They didn't need to. They stood just at the edge of the fog, and Mara felt the boundary again, an invisible rule, the Blight's restraint. Then one of them lifted a hand and pointed, slowly, toward Mara's position. Not a direct, accusatory point, a thoughtful one. Found you. Mara didn't flinch. Flinching was a confession. She raised 2 fingers and signed to Kellen. Route change. Now. Kellen nodded and slid into the brush, angling hard away from the trail. Mara signaled the rest. Single file, spacing tight, no backtracking. They moved deeper into the trees, away from the path they'd cut. Behind them, the villagers did not follow. They remained where they were, motionless, watching. That was the point. They weren't trying to catch the 7th oath. They were showing the 7th oath that they could. Half a mile later, Mara halted again, crouching behind a fallen log, slick with moss. She looked at each of them, one by one, making sure their eyes still held their own names. Stone's jaw was hard. Rook's anger was coiled tight enough to snap. Holden's hands were steady on Ebris, but her face looked like someone had carved grief into it. Iriel's gaze was sharp and distant, calculating geometry and betrayal. Kellen was already thinking in rotes and shadows, the tiefling's predator focus turned outward. Z watched them all with a stillness that felt almost gentle, like a blade laid flat in a palm rather than held at a throat. Mara pulled the wax from one ear. Not all the way, just enough to let real sound leak in. The forest rushed back at her. Wind in needles, the thin creak of wood, the faint hush of fog, moving like cloth. And beneath it, faint as a thought you tried not to have. A murmur. Not words. Not quite. A human cadence without human intention. Mara shoved the wax back in, hard enough to sting. We don't listen, she mouthed to the team. We don't answer. Ebris lifted his slate again, hand shaking. He scratched slowly this time, as if every letter cost him something. It will follow the roads. It will learn the routes. It will come west. Mara stared at the words and felt the weight of the Republic's map. Clean lines, crisp borders, the lie that mountains were walls. Mountains were only stone. The Blight learned stone. Kellen tapped his chest, then pointed west. Message must go. Mara nodded. Break contact wasn't just escape. It was transmission. It was getting a warning back to the Republic before the Republic turned it into a story that made investors comfortable. Rook signed, blunt, burn it. Mara held his gaze. Burning a town didn't erase what lived beneath it. Burning made smoke. Smoke made panic. Panic made the Blight's job easier. Halden signed back, sharper than her small hands suggested. People. Stone's fingers curled once, then relaxed. like he'd grabbed a memory and forced himself to let it go. He signed 2 words. Heavy. Contain. Later. Iriel drew a small circle in the air, and then slashed through it. Infrastructure, then tapped her temple. Learning, then pointed east, source. Z spoke quietly, and Mara felt her words in her bones, even through wax. It knows discipline now, Z said. It knows we choose silence. It will find another way to make us speak. Mara believed her. Mara rose, slow and controlled, and signed the decision that mattered most. We leave. We warn. We return with fire and proof. Kellen nodded once, already moving. Iriel collected her tools with practiced efficiency. Stone hoisted Ebris partly onto his shoulder to spare his legs. Holden kept a hand on Ebris's wrist, counting pulse by touch like she could anchor him to being human. Rook took rearguard. Knife out now, anger turned into purpose. Z fell in beside Mara, still and watchful, her presence a promise of catastrophe, held behind teeth. They moved west through the trees, away from Larchgate, away from the chapel and its waiting congregation. Behind them, the forest remained quiet. Too quiet. And Mara knew, without hearing it, that the Blight was doing what it did best. Not charging, not raging, just spreading. Patient as rot, curious as a child, clever as a liar. And somewhere, in the fog-lidded valley, a village that would not die held its breath again and practiced being alive. End of chapter.